Welcome to Driven to Lead. I'm your host, Wayne Brandon. In this series, we explore the real world stories of key executives to find the leadership lessons that help move us all forward. If you like these conversations, we'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe and like button. It'll help us out a lot. But now we got another great program for you today, so let's make it happen. Very happy to have with us today Shaffiq Rahim, formerly the CEO and president of Lifetech Resources out of Los Angeles, California. Shaffiq is a very, very interesting leader because he's worked as a CFO, worked in the financial area of the business deep, and then moved into general management in high-tech engineering products, as well as the personal care products arena. He's got a broad scope of experience to share with us. Shaffiq, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to have you with us. Talk to us a little bit about this personal care products industry. You know, I'm very interested in what's going on in kind of personal health care and how, you know, the more formal medical and pharmaceutical kind of treatment area is kind of blended into a lot of, you know, kind of health and wellness programs and personal coaches and now personal care products as well, kind of blending that all together. Talk to us about the personal care products since you've been in that quite heavily of late.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, there's so much between wellness and cosmetics coming together, beauty and wellness rather, coming together and merging into one mega industry, really. You know, people now when they buy their skincare products, their hair care products, they want to understand the science behind it. You know, clean beauty and clean cosmetics are really a thing. People care about what's in, you know, what ingredients are in there, because they want to make sure that, you know, they're using products that they are comfortable putting on their bodies and sometimes in their bodies, especially if it's a capsule they're swallowing. So it's really interesting to see.
Let me interrupt just for a second because I even think about things I put on my skin. I mean, these things are getting absorbed to some extent into the bloodstream.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. Yeah, and so more and more people are being more and more conscious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so these personal care products are having this overlap. So I think it kind of lends a great deal of incremental responsibility for the companies who are in this space because the expectations are there. Are there regulatory issues that you have to deal with as well?
Yeah. So you know, there's the FDA is always involved in some form or fashion. You know, most products are deemed cosmetic grade, meaning they're not classified as a drug or OTC type classification. But when you get into the heavy and harsh chemicals, the dermatology grade type stuff, you end up also down an OTC path. And then even how it's applied, because if it's applied in a certain manner, it could be viewed as a medical device. So, you know, you have to think about application as well as the product itself, you know, and how does that get classified? How do you market it? You know, like one thing that I learned very quickly, which is very interesting, is, you know, products that help you grow back, you know, your nail health, your hairs. Again, under FDA requirements, you can't use the word grow because grow makes it a medical device. So most of these cosmetic products that do help grow, they use the word enhance. It enhances your hair.
Say enhance,
yeah. So it's very interesting to see, you know, how people skirt the lines to get their product on the market.
And, you know, I think another factor would be that, you know, there are so many, I'm sure the audience experiences this as well. There's so many offers that come up through, you know, the social media advertising that we're all exposed to about products that do amazing things. And a lot of them are topical personal care type products. And I just don't believe most of the stuff I hear there, but this sensationalism around the way they're being marketed would take the, you know, a core, you know, kind of set of products that a company like yours had that, you know, it would kind of deteriorate the value, the opportunity, the market share penetration. It's just a competitive environment to be very difficult to compete with.
Yeah, well, and I think you bring up a good point. You know, one of the things that I noticed in the industry is that you know, again, from an ethical, moral standpoint, I would never move forward with these types of clients. You know, we always, you know, there's always new brands and indie brands popping up, and we had multiple instances where a potential customer said, great. We know we should be, doing these tests. And these tests are going to cost 25 to $50,000. We don't have that cash to launch the brand,
Mm.
or to invest in the brand. So
Uh-huh.
we know there's a risk with the FDA, but we don't want to spend the money. I said, I'm sure there's other manufacturers out there that'll do that, but from a
Right.
moral responsibility, I cannot do that to the
Right.
consumer in the market. And I think it's very interesting to see that there are manufacturers that are willing to do that, because your brand is essentially on the line even as the manufacturer.
Yeah, yeah. And the personal care product space, kind of extends also into a lot of medical or quasi-medical practitioners who are now
Yeah,
doing hormone replacement therapies and injections, fillers, Botox, those kinds
yeah,
of things as well. So that the whole space is very crowded and very
yeah.
difficult for consumers to figure out. What advice would you give to kind of the leaders or the marketers of that space and personal care products to how would they build trust, credibility, get their products understood? Do you have any
Yeah.
advice in that
So,
arena?
so the best brands that I've seen recently that have done a great job is they start, obviously marketing wise, everything is digital first now. Nothing is like a commercial or retail. It starts with digital. But the best brands out there, they build a community. They are authentic. They show up in how they show up in the space. They get their
Okay.
consumers engaged, right? So it is an active community, and they even start to then find certain consumers that they want to test products as well, and say, give us your feedback. What do you think about this? Let us know how we can
Good.
make this better. I think the more that the consumer feels engaged, you'll get that natural marketing of the consumer about your products. Whether it's TikTok, whether it's Instagram, you want people talking about it. And I think the most successful brands I've seen, they show up authentic and they have a community that talks about their products and loves their products.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Building relationships and building trust has always been a great sales technique. And if you can do
Yep.
it now in the digital world with the communities you're talking with,
Yeah.
that it just kind of follows naturally from what I'd always thought would be true. And I agree with that.
Yeah.
Uh, I know you came up through the financial side of the business, the CFO track, and then to, more general leadership. Did you
Yeah.
always want to be a numbers guy, or was that kind of part of your calculus when you were going through,
Yeah.
undergrad and graduate school, and just thinking about, how your career would unfold? Now you're kind of
Yeah.
more of in a general management space. I mean, what were your intentions, and how did you end up here?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring that up. So when I stepped into the CEO position at Lifetech, I had an employee actually ask me, is it scary to be in the CEO role? Is this something that you always kind of thought of? And the reality is, ever since I was a teenager, my goal was to be a CEO and lead a company. But the one thing
Okay,
that you don't necessarily realize is you find different paths to get there. Um,
sure,
and
absolutely.
for me, I loved finance and numbers, and I started my career as an engineer. One of the
Okay,
best advices I got from a mentor growing up was, Shaffiq, I can tell you have a really good, strong technical knack and kind of curiosity. He said,
hmm,
don't get your undergrad degree in a business degree. Get it in a technical field, so that way you
hmm,
bring something else to the table. And this individual was a engineer who started, but he was also an entrepreneur. Started his own company, sold it, and did it
right.
again. So I really appreciated that advice. And so I got my bachelor's and master's in computer science. Went back on my MBA in finance and accounting. I'd always helped my dad. My dad was an entrepreneur as well. I used to help my dad with his tax books and accounting. So for me, it
Hmm,
just came naturally and easy.
yeah,
And so I never knew what the path would be to CEO, but CFO was a good path, and I knew I love numbers, and
sure.
I feel
Yeah.
like it helped me as a CEO to be very cognizant of where we spend money as well, to have that financial background.
I've worked with a lot of CEOs, presidents, general management leaders who came up the finance route. I have to say, some of them are better than others at making that
Yeah.
transition.
Yep.
But logically having a firm understanding of all the financial aspects of the business,
Yeah.
how to really, manage and project and forecast your business, and certainly how to manage cash is
Yeah.
critical to businesses large and small. So,
Exactly.
there's other aspects to leadership. And I'm a leadership coach as well. So I work with people who have various strengths and weaknesses all the time. And the most important thing is really just understanding, that you're there to provide value for the shareholders of the company,
Yep.
whether that be individuals or if it's a public company.
Yep.
And you're going to add value by putting your customers first, putting your employees first,
Yep.
believing in your products and making a good financial plan to drive that business competitively in the marketplace. And so
Yeah.
it sounds like you were able to do that, and that served you pretty well.
Yeah. I used
Shaffiq,
to joke. I used to joke around with companies when I would interview for the CFO position. I
yeah,
said, if you're looking for a bean counter accounting type CPA, I'm not your
yeah,
person. If you want someone who's going to bring strategic value in the financial function,
mhm,
that's where I feel like I bring a lot of value, and I feel like that
yeah,
innately then makes sense to move into the CEO role because I've always been strategic as a CFO.
right, right. So
Yeah.
good for you. Well, look, this program's about leadership lessons, as you know, and
Yeah.
let's move into the heart of the program here. We
Yeah.
look for the leadership lessons that are inside of the key stories from key executives like yourself. So
Yeah.
we ask you to be on the program today so you can tell us a story, set it up for us, give us the background, when it
Yeah.
happened in your career, whatever details we need to understand either a major challenge or a huge win or some combination of both,
Yeah.
that you can tell us about. And then let's discuss the leadership lessons inside that so that the listeners of this program can take away something of value.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, just a couple of years ago, when I first joined Lifetech Resources, one of the things that I was tasked to do was to essentially lead a operational restructuring and turnaround, organizational turnaround of the business. Financially, the company was fine, but a lot of people from the prior CEO were put in positions because they were friends of the CEO. A lot
Mm,
of it was favoritism, but they weren't necessarily skilled in the roles they were in.
yeah, the
Um,
problem. Yeah.
yeah, and so day one of me moving into the interim CEO role, I was initially joined as the CFO. So I had to
Mhm.
unfortunately let go of the CEO, the COO, and one other person within the management function within the company. All of a sudden, come Monday, I was still CFO, interim CEO, de facto COO, and a
Mhm.
week into it, our head of quality quit, and she's had another opportunity. She told me, she said, Shafiq, if you were in that position 6 months ago, I wouldn't be quitting on you. But I could tell she was
Right.
burned out. And I think,
Mhm.
first leadership lesson there is, you never want to convince someone to stay once they've hit that point of burnout. It's best for them to move on. They have another opportunity.
Sure.
It's going to hurt the company. It's going to hurt them. You're not going to get the value you want. So, that's one leadership lesson I would definitely share with your listeners. you know,
Mhm.
but once I got into that position, the one thing that I wanted to do also was to make sure that we hired the right people. It wasn't just about putting a body in an empty chair. And so one by one, I had to fill these positions. It took about 6 months, and all at the same time, I had to make sure our customers, didn't jump ship because they were worried about what's going on at Lifetech. So
Mhm.
I had to really build that trust and confidence with our customers, spend time with them, make sure that there was no hiccups in their production and quality of their products, so that they felt comfortable during this process. And at the end of the 6 months, when we went through this transformation, all of the customers told me, they said, Shafiq, we were very nervous going into this when you told us what you were doing, but we see the value. We see the upgrade.
Mhm.
We're getting better responses. We feel like we have a stronger partnership now with Lifetech. And to me, that was always a goal. But it's such a hard balance, right? Again, as the leader, you are
Mhm.
accountable at the end of the day if customers jump ship or if employees start to jump ship, because during this, you also don't want to lose good employees.
Right.
And so I think the one thing that I also felt is, at the end of the day, I'm accountable for the decisions I make, the lives I'm affecting. We have 150 employees plus another 100 or so temp labor employees. All of these
Mhm.
people rely on a paycheck from the company, right? If something happens to the company,
Absolutely.
that is their
100%.
livelihood. Yeah. And so I think for me, that was such an interesting point to undertake, transforming the company, not losing customers, and then focusing on growth, right? And that's always the fun part, but there's a lot of heartache to get to that point because we knew we had to kind of rip the band-aids off, and make a lot of changes.
Yeah, so no, it's very interesting. I think a number of key points to unpack in there. So,
Yeah,
first leadership lesson is you can't let the business fail when you're going through, reorganization type
yeah,
issues, right? So, I expect that required you to jump in to the deep end of the pool a few times and
yeah,
learn what was going on or the functional aspects that these other leaders were responsible for
exactly. Yeah,
as well. And then what happened is by you being more closely aligned with the business and the needs of the business and the executional aspects, when you rehired for those positions, you could
yeah,
do it in a much more intelligent way than would have happened if you hadn't been able to do that. So that's a really good
exactly.
lesson. I
Yeah,
like,
I think that's one thing that happens all too often is people are too scared to let someone go because they've been there 10 years, even if they're not
yeah,
doing a good job, and they just
yeah,
let it hobble along.
right.
It's better to say it's not working. We need to find someone who's going to be the right fit.
You got to be ready to jump in yourself and learn and lead,
Yeah,
from the front in those cases where
yeah,
you got to take the responsibility. And before you can give the accountability to a new person, you really have to understand what you're passing along and what your expectations are and how to
yeah.
communicate. So that's a really good lesson there.
I think also something that was interesting during that transformation was it was a big cultural transformation. When I first joined the company, it was a lot of fear. The CEO would yell orders at people and tell them what to do. So you didn't have this collaboration. People were too scared to bring up
Right.
a mistake.
Yeah.
So I had to start to build that trust with the employees that did stay, and then all the new
Mhm.
hires. I had to make sure culturally that they fit the model that I wanted, where people felt open to speak up. People collaborated more and kind of
Mhm.
talked to each other rather than sitting in silos. And again, it was so interesting to watch that transform because then you start to realize that if you do make a bad hire, again, not every hire is going to be the right hire, but if you
Right.
hire someone that doesn't fit the new culture, they're going to stick out like a sore thumb, and you're going to know pretty quickly like this person's not a good fit, and they, even if they're smart, if they don't fit the culture, they're going to rub people the wrong way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And
Yeah,
in doing working on that transformation of the culture, I'm sure you made it clear through your communications what the
yeah,
new culture would be and what the expectations would be. But
yeah,
sometimes we need to reinforce that with actions and so
yeah,
that people can see that you really mean that. Did
yeah.
people call you out sometimes on what you'd said or did they feel free enough to raise issues that might have made the previous CEO angry?
Yeah, absolutely. People, I've always had an open door policy, even when I was in the CFO role. But one thing I've found is, when you build trust with team members, they feel
Mm-hmm.
comfortable coming to you with potential issues, you
Of
know,
course.
um, letting you know when you're wrong, right? Again, I have no problem. I remember one meeting where we were talking about how to batch a certain type of product, and we had our head of the tech transfer team. He's the one that basically gets the product ready for commercialization, um, and we were noticing some issues in the first batch of production. So I called the team together. I said, okay, you guys are all SMEs. Let's all come with the ideas. But I brought my own idea and I said, hey, Jeff, please, tell me if I'm wrong, but, my thought is, could we do X, Y, Z? And he had no problem telling me I was wrong and explaining to me why I was wrong, right? I was
Okay.
because he knew I was open to that feedback.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah,
And yeah, and then if you have other people who can observe that, then they'll see that you're really just looking for the best solution. You're not looking
yeah,
for personal ownership or power and control over others. It's difficult when that's been the kind of the MO in the company for a while.
yeah,
It's difficult
yeah.
to make the change. So
Well,
good on you. I mean, I'm sure you
thank you.
I'm sure you did that in a way that actually built that trust. So
Yeah,
it's easier said than done. So
yeah.
good for you. And then in terms of the performance of the company, how quickly did you notice that the performance was going to turn around and start to improve with these new people, the new processes, a new cultural norm, and the ability? I'm sure you delegated more authority
Yeah,
and gave more accountability in the organization as well as you mentioned earlier. So with
yeah.
all this in place, did you start to see a change in some of the key metrics you were tracking for the business?
Absolutely. So first of all, when I joined, there was no KPIs and metrics being
Okay.
tracked. Other than I think there was a couple of operational metrics that the former operations manager had, but there wasn't an established KPI for every department. So we actually started to build that out, and we started noticing a difference. I'll give you an example. In the quality department, as soon as the head of quality worked with his managers and said, "Okay, let's develop, the metrics for your people,"
Mhm.
they started to realize that some people weren't performing where they should be. One individual, in fact, they sat down, talked to him once they realized that he wasn't performing at that level, and he picked it
Mhm.
up. But as soon as the manager stopped overseeing and micromanaging and watching, his performance went down again. So
Mhm.
they had to address it with him. Unfortunately, we had to let that person go. But it was so
Mhm.
interesting because until you develop those metrics, you just assume people are doing their job, and you don't have anything to track as a baseline.
Right, exactly. Well, it's an old adage that I think everyone knows that you can't manage anything you can't measure, right? So
Yep.
another aspect of that I believe strongly in is the more frequently you measure something, the
Yeah.
more likely is that your management is going to be continuous and strong and effective, right? So,
Absolutely.
um, I think if you did one thing as a leader in an organization, if you took, let's say they had great KPIs in place already, and so the metrics were relevant and they were a good indicator of strengths and weaknesses in the organization, both operationally and performance wise.
Yeah.
If you did nothing else that the company was failing, but just to start measure those things more quickly, instead of
Yeah.
doing it monthly, do it every 2 weeks, or it's a quality issue, measure it hourly instead of daily. And
Yeah.
very quickly, you start to see where the deficits are, where they're created, what's happening, and sometimes who's associated with it. And as you say, you coach them up, you get
Yeah.
them, you get them the tools they need, the training they need to make it work, or in the rare unfortunate cases where that won't work, you have to let them go. But
Yeah.
it's really a key to doing what you're doing. So good on you that you accomplished that.
Thank you.
Anything else with this story? I mean, lots of good leadership lessons there already.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would also add in there is, to that point on metrics and accountability, you
Hmm.
really have to make sure you have good leaders on your team that also take their own accountability, right? So when they are tracking these metrics, that they realize, hey, something needs to change, something's not working. They take it on themselves to say, hey, this is a failure on my part. I need to now hone in on XYZ, fix
Yeah,
whatever's broken. And I think
right,
it's so critical to find people that have that same
right.
mindset. It doesn't. Yeah, at the end of the day, the CEO is accountable for everything, but you should
Hmm.
also be accountable within your department, and take that ownership.
Sure. Yeah, I think the organizations I've been associated with, uh, where accountability was working the way I think it should, and
Yeah,
this is what I teach in my consulting and my coaching work as well, is that you communicate very clearly, very thoroughly what
yeah,
the expectations are to the people who are responsible. You make clear that they are responsible for this aspect of the
yeah,
task of the delivery. You give
yeah,
them all the tools that they need, all the resources and all the tools, and all of the authority to
yeah.
act to make that
Exactly.
successful. And then you have them support the measurement and look at it themselves and then
Yeah,
report that up to the organization. And when
exactly.
that's done well, Shaffiq, I think you and I are probably on the same page here. When that's done well, the organization really has a culture of accountability because
Yeah,
everyone knows whether they did or didn't accomplish the objective. Everyone around them knows if they did or
yep,
didn't. And they know that they had the authority, they had the resources, they were empowered. Now, maybe we just made a bad forecast or we didn't anticipate some external factor. Maybe everyone
yeah,
did a really good job. But then that also is known. So you don't even have to make, I call them LAEs, lame ass excuses. You don't have to create any
yep,
LAEs. You just, it's because it's known what happened. So then you just focus on making it better and solving the issue and working
yeah,
together. So I like
yeah,
accountability at that level, and it sounds like you
yeah.
do too.
Exactly. And I think something I've learned a lot from my early engineering days in my career is when a problem arises, you want to document what happened and how do we mitigate it from happening
Mhm.
again. But in the documentation, there's never finger pointing, there's never blaming. It's more
Right,
about, okay, what happened and how do we fix it? And
right,
I've always led with that mentality as well of, okay,
yeah,
I want you to feel free bringing up an issue. Let's investigate what happened. How do we prevent it from happening? I don't need the finger pointing, right? At the end of the day, the data will,
right,
if someone isn't doing their job, the data will point to it and we'll make decisions to move
yeah.
on. But we don't need to do that in the moment.
I was leading a leadership roundtable recently with a group of executives here in my part of Florida,
Yeah.
and one of the executives shared a concept a concept with me that was called 131. I'd never heard of it before. I thought I heard of most leadership concepts,
Yeah.
but this one was just on that. It was on problem resolution, and I think it was, if I remember correctly, you have one problem. So if someone is complaining about a problem in the organization or they're frustrated by something, and they
Yeah.
come to you as a leader of the organization, they would tell you what the problem is.
Yeah.
And then you'd say, okay, the next step they would know is that they need to provide three possible solutions. And then,
Yeah.
so whenever you bring a problem, bring three possible solutions. And then the last one of the three, one problem, three potential solutions, what is the solution that they would recommend that we
Yeah.
pursue to fix this problem in the future? So it kind of puts it puts the responsibility in the entire organization. If you're going to identify a problem,
Yeah.
bring solutions,
Yeah.
and the ultimate solve that you believe is there. Whether you choose that ultimate solve they choose, or one of the other solutions, or even a fourth or fifth one that they didn't
Yeah.
anticipate, it's a really good practice so that people focus positively on fixing the issue rather than just highlighting the issue and pointing fingers at other people, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that was again, as part of that cultural shift, at both Lifetech and High Tech previously,
Mm-hmm.
I started getting the team thinking that way. Okay, if you're going to bring up a problem, great. Now come to me with solutions. Don't just bring up the problem. And it's so interesting to see how people think about it differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they come to you with a problem now, they've thought about
Right.
it. They've thought about potential solutions and what they recommend, like you said.
Sure. Yeah.
But it changes their mindset, and they feel empowered because,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, and most of the time you're going to select one of their solutions because
absolutely,
they're closer to it. They know perhaps best anyway.
exactly,
Okay, Shaffiq, that was some very interesting conversation. Thanks for sharing that story and
yeah,
all of those insights. As we kind of move to wrap up our discussion today, let's
yeah,
turn to the two questions I always ask my guests. And the first one is, all right, you're a younger man now. We rewind 20 years, 30 years.
yeah.
What one piece of advice would you give your younger self?
I think the one piece of advice I'd give my younger self is um, be patient. You
Yeah.
know, um, uh, I've always tried to operate with humility. But I think that would still be something I'd share with my younger self. Um,
Hmm.
and lastly, I think is, your career path isn't going to be a linear path like that. It's not going to just go
Hmm.
straight. You're going to go like this, up and down, up and
Hmm.
down. And
Sure.
as long as you're still aiming for the goal you're aiming for, you will get there.
Right.
And just be dedicated and resilient in your
Yeah.
career. Yeah.
Yeah. Patience is really it is a virtue,
Yeah.
is as the old adage goes, and
Yeah.
it's sometimes difficult, especially when we're young and we're hungry and we want to move fast, right? And
Yeah.
we want that linear path to the boardroom, but
Yeah.
or whatever our aspiration is. But the tacking, to use a sailing analogy, is really often required. And you just want to make sure you have a compass pointing you in the general direction you want to go. Because if you tack
Exactly.
too far offline and you start going another direction, you need to catch yourself. But being
Yeah.
patient with the path is really key. And what I find, the reason it's so important, and that comes up in my leadership coaching quite a bit, is when we get impatient, we lose a lot of the passion for doing the job well,
Yeah.
and the passion for caring about others along the way. And those things are so important. At the end of our lives, at the end of our careers, the only thing that's really going to be important is the lives we touched and the things we did together. I mean, the
Yeah.
profits we bring in, the awards we win, they're nice and they're important,
Yeah.
but it's not the end all and be all. So when you're impatient, you can kind of step on ground that you don't really feel good about, and it doesn't always match your ethics and your morality. And so I
Yeah.
think the patience is necessary to put you in a good place. And it's also important, in my experience, to be happy and fulfilled right
Yeah.
now, rather
Yeah.
than always waiting to the future to feel happy and fulfilled.
Absolutely.
And when I was a younger man, I was impatient and I didn't think about taking care of myself, or enjoying the ride as much. I was just,
Yeah.
on the mission, right? And I was just
Yeah.
charging forward, head down, backside up, and moving forward, pushing. But good
Yeah.
advice. And
Yeah.
I echo that. I would tell my younger self to be more patient as well. All right, let's fast forward the other direction. So now
Yeah.
we're 25, 30 years from now, you and I are sitting together having a nice coffee, watching a sunset out there in LA where you are. And we're talking about all the things that happened in our lives and our career. What are you
Yeah.
going to tell me you're most proud of?
I think I think for me the most thing I'd hopefully be proud of in 20, 25 years is that I, I led with empathy. Trained and educated a lot of good leaders that are continuing, beyond even after I left the room,
Mhm.
and that I was successful, not only from a growing the company standpoint, but also growing good leaders along the way. And a lot of those people are still people that I would hopefully be connected with, and
Mhm.
maybe watching a sunset with them in 25 years as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. What a great legacy to leave, right? If you can train, develop, encourage, inspire, empower
yeah,
others to be
yeah,
leaders and to have that impact on others, that multiplicative effect
yeah,
is very valuable. So I think that's a very, very good response.
yeah.
And
And
at the end of
I
the
think
day,
I
go
think one thing
ahead.
that's interesting is leadership. Yeah, it's automatic in the title when you're a CEO or an executive in a company, but to be a leader, you don't really have to be an executive. Leaders are in all levels.
Mhm.
One thing, especially when we talk about, again, leading with empathy. So my mom was a paralegal for 20 plus years. And when she passed away, 500 people attended her funeral. In
Wow.
the Starbucks next to her office, because she used to go to Starbucks every day, the
Yeah.
Starbucks next to her office closed for the day so that all the Starbucks employees could come to the funeral. They brought her
Wow.
favorite drink, and I was just touched. Like I knew she was
Yeah.
a really good person, but to witness that, it was amazing.
Yeah, that's inspiring. That makes me
Yeah,
want to smile and cry at the same time. I love that. That's great.
yeah,
I was just going to say, in a broader note, at the end of your career, it just like as I'm getting older now and closer to the end than the beginning,
yeah,
the thing that I really value is when people call me or reach out to me I've worked with in the past, and maybe
yeah,
we reminisce a little bit about what we did together. But it's about the impact we had on each other and
yeah.
the respect and love that we still have for each other. I think those are the real important things, and clearly
Absolutely.
sounds like your mom knew that in spades, and good for her. Good for
Yeah,
her.
yep. And between me and my brother, we say, we are a reflection of her and how she raised us, so we want to continue that legacy.
Yeah, live up to that standard, right? I think
Yeah,
it's great to have heroes in our lives, and it sounds like she was in that respect. So I like to
absolutely.
look at people I admire and say, how can I be more like them? I'm a follower of Christ, so I look at him as kind of the guide. How can I
Yeah,
be more like that? I fail every day in being
yeah.
more like that, but you got to have that standard that you work toward, right? And I
Exactly.
and I think that's important that we do that with key individuals along the way in our career. So
Yeah,
if people wanted to reach out to you and get in touch with you, how would they do that?
absolutely. LinkedIn obviously is always a great resource. I'm on
Okay.
LinkedIn. They can find my
Good.
profile. My email is shafiq@gmail.com. They can reach me that way.
Mhm.
And happy to be a resource to anyone out there.
That sounds great. Well, it's been a wonderful pleasure to talk with you today and to
Thank
explore
you
some of these leadership insights and get to know you a little bit, Shaffiq. Certainly,
for sure.
I hope we can stay in touch going forward. I look forward to that.
Absolutely.
And thanks for being a part of the program, and God bless.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on, and yeah, I look forward to staying in touch.
Well, that's it for Driven to Lead today. We really appreciate you being with us. Share this with a friend or a business colleague if you would. And if I could remind you again, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. We're very grateful for that. So until next time, always remember the high road leads to a better place.